It was supposed to be a peaceful retreat. My friends and I had planned the trip for months. A weekend getaway to a remote cabin deep in the woods. We were all looking forward to disconnecting from the world, enjoying nature, and spending quality time together. The drive took us about 5 hours, winding through narrow, tree-lined roads that seemed to get darker and denser as we went. By the time we reached the cabin, the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the clearing. The cabin itself was quaint and rustic, with a porch that overlooked a small, serene lake. It seemed perfect. The first night was uneventful. We cooked dinner over the fire pit, shared stories, and laughed late into the night. The forest around us was alive with the sounds of nature. Crickets chirping, leaves rustling, and the occasional owl hooting in the distance. It felt like we were in another world, far removed from the hustle and bustle of our everyday lives. The second day, we decided to explore the woods. Armed with a map and our sense of adventure, we set off on a hike. The deeper we went, the more we felt the weight of the forest around us. The trees were ancient, their gnarled branches intertwining to form a dense canopy overhead. The air was cool and damp, filled with the earthy scent of moss and decaying leaves. After a few hours, we stumbled upon an old, abandoned cabin. It was much smaller and more decrepit than the one we were staying in, with broken windows and a collapsed roof. Curious, we decided to take a look inside. The floorboards creaked under our weight as we stepped inside, and dust motes danced in the beams of sunlight that filtered through the broken windows. There wasn't much inside, just a few pieces of broken furniture and an old, rusted stove. As we were about to leave, something caught my eye in the corner of the cabin. Partially hidden under a pile of debris was a small, leather-bound book. I picked it up and brushed off the dust, revealing a worn, handwritten journal. That evening, back at our cabin, I began to read the journal. It belonged to a man named Samuel, who had lived in the abandoned cabin in the early 1900s. His entries were filled with accounts of strange occurrences, unexplained noises, eerie lights in the forest, and a growing sense of dread that seemed to consume him. The more I read, the more I felt a chill creeping up my spine. Samuel wrote about seeing shadowy figures watching him from the trees, hearing whispers in the dead of night, and feeling an oppressive presence that seemed to follow him wherever he went. His final entries were frantic and disjointed, detailing a descent into madness and fear. He wrote about seeing his own reflection in the mirror but with eyes that weren't his own, and about something trying to break into his cabin at night. By the time I finished reading, it was late, and everyone else had gone to bed. I couldn't shake the feeling of unease that had settled over me. I decided to get some fresh air and stepped out onto the porch. The night was unnervingly quiet, the usual symphony of forest sounds conspicuously absent. As I stood there, I thought I saw something move in the trees at the edge of the clearing. A shadowy figure, just like Samuel had described. I hurried back inside and locked the door, my heart pounding. I told myself it was just my imagination, fueled by the eerie journal entries, but deep down, I knew something wasn't right. I slept fitfully that night, plagued by nightmares of shadowy figures and whispers in the dark. The next day, I told my friends about the journal and the figure I had seen. They laughed it off, attributing it to my overactive imagination and the spooky stories in the journal. But as the day went on, they too began to feel the weight of the forest pressing in on us. The sense of unease grew stronger, and we decided to cut our trip short and leave the next morning. That night, the atmosphere in the cabin was tense. Every creak and groan of the old woods set us on edge. As we sat around the fireplace, trying to distract ourselves with games and stories, the power suddenly went out, plunging us into darkness. We scrambled to find our flashlights and candles, our nerves fraying with each passing minute. Just as we managed to light a few candles, we heard it, a soft, rhythmic tapping on the windows. My blood ran cold as we all turned to look outside. In the dim light of the candles, we saw them, shadowy figures standing just beyond the edge of the porch, watching us with eyes that seemed to glow in the darkness. Panic set in. We locked all the doors and windows, huddling together in the center of the cabin. The tapping grew louder, more insistent, and was soon accompanied by whispers, soft, unintelligible murmurs that seemed to come from all around us. It felt like the walls were closing in, and the air grew thick with the sense of impending doom. Suddenly, the tapping stopped. The silence was deafening, and we held our breath, waiting for whatever was to come next. Without warning, the front door burst open, and a cold wind swept through the cabin, extinguishing the candles and plunging us back into darkness. We heard footsteps, heavy, deliberate, and growing closer. In a blind panic, we scrambled for the back door, desperate to escape. As we burst out into the night, we saw them, dozens of shadowy figures surrounding the cabin, their eyes glowing in the darkness. We ran, our hearts pounding in our chests, not daring to look back. We didn't stop until we reached the car. We drove away as fast as we could, the eerie silence of the forest giving way to the comforting hum of the engine. It wasn't until we were miles away that we dared to breathe a sigh of relief. We never spoke of that night again. The journal was left behind, a relic of a nightmare we wished to forget. Elmwood House remained abandoned, a silent sentinel in the woods, its secrets buried in the shadows. Years later, I sometimes find myself thinking back to that weekend, wondering what might have happened if we had stayed. The memories still haunt me, a reminder of the darkness that can lurk within even the most innocent-seeming places. If you ever come across an old, abandoned cabin in the woods, remember our story. Sometimes the past is best left undisturbed, and some doors should never be opened. It was a cold, dreary November day when I first moved into the old Victorian house on the outskirts of town. The place had been on the market for months, and when I finally decided to buy it, I was drawn to its charm and the potential I saw in its creaky wooden floors and stained glass windows. The price was right, and though it was a fixer-upper, I was looking forward to the challenge. The first few days were a whirlwind of unpacking and settling in. The house was massive, with rooms that seemed to stretch on forever and an attic that I had yet to explore. I had heard stories about the house being haunted, but I dismissed them as local legends. I was more interested in the architectural details and the space for my personal projects. It wasn't until the second week that I began to notice something strange. At first, it was minor, a light flickering in the hallway, an occasional creak that seemed out of place. But then, as I was working late one night, I heard something that made my blood run cold. It was a thumping noise, rhythmic and deliberate, coming from above. I glanced up, puzzled. I was alone in the house, and the sound was coming from the attic. I had never been up there since moving in, and the thought of someone or something making noise there sent a shiver down my spine. I decided to investigate, rationalizing that it was probably just the house settling. I grabbed a flashlight and made my way to the attic entrance, a small door at the end of a narrow hallway. The stairs leading up were steep and narrow, the wood old and worn. The flashlight's beam cut through the darkness as I ascended. When I reached the attic, I hesitated before opening the door. The thumping had stopped, and an oppressive silence now hung in the air. I took a deep breath and pushed open the door, the old hinges creaking loudly. The attic was dusty and cluttered, filled with old furniture covered in sheets and cardboard boxes stacked haphazardly. I scanned the room with my flashlight, trying to locate the source of the noise. The attic was filled with relics from another time. an old rocking chair, a vintage trunk, and various knickknacks that seemed to tell stories of the past. But there was no sign of anything unusual. I checked every corner, every box, but found nothing out of the ordinary. I began to think that maybe I had imagined the noise, that it was just the house settling as I had originally thought. I turned to leave, but then something caught my eye. In the corner of the attic, partially hidden behind a stack of boxes, was a large, ornate mirror. The glass was covered in dust, and the frame was intricately carved, almost baroque. It was out of place among the rest of the clutter, and I was intrigued. I approached it, wiping the dust away with my sleeve to get a better look. As the dust cleared, I noticed something strange. The reflection in the mirror was not quite right. The room appeared darker, the shadows deeper. I moved the flashlight around, trying to see if the reflection was simply distorted by the light, but the effect remained unsettling. I shrugged it off as an optical illusion and decided to leave the attic. As I descended the stairs, the thumping noise started again, louder this time, as if someone was deliberately trying to get my attention. My heart pounded in my chest as I hurried back to the first floor, the noise echoing behind me. The next few days were filled with constant unease. The thumping continued sporadically, and I began to feel like I was being watched. I would catch glimpses of movement out of the corner of my eye, only to turn and find nothing there. The feeling of being observed grew stronger each day, an annoying discomfort that I couldn't ignore. One night, I decided to stay up late, determined to uncover the source of the disturbance. I set up a camera in the attic, hoping to capture any unusual activity. The footage was grainy and unremarkable, showing nothing but the cluttered space and the occasional shadow cast by the flashlight's beam. Frustrated, I decided to spend the night in the attic, convinced that if I was there, I might finally get answers. I brought a sleeping bag and some snacks, settling into the dusty old rocking chair. The silence was almost deafening, broken only by the occasional creak of the house settling. As the night wore on, I felt a growing sense of dread. The air in the attic was cold, old, and oppressive, and the shadows seemed to move and shift in the darkness. I kept my flashlight on, trying to reassure myself that I was just being paranoid. Then, in the dead of night, the thumping began again. It was louder than ever, more insistent. I felt a chill run down my spine as I sat in the rocking chair, the sound coming from the far corner of the attic. My flashlight flickered, and I could see a shadow moving against the wall. I mustered the courage to investigate, moving cautiously toward the corner. The shadow seemed to pulse with a life of its own, and I could feel a cold, eerie presence surrounding me. As I approached the mirror, I noticed that it seemed to be the source of the shadow. The glass was now clear, and the reflection was no longer distorted. I looked into the mirror and saw something that made my blood run cold. Behind me, in the reflection, was a figure. A tall, gaunt man with hollow eyes and a twisted expression. He was standing just out of sight, his presence barely perceptible. My heart raced as I spun around, but there was no one there. I turned back to the mirror, and the figure was still there, closer now, reaching out as if trying to escape the confines of the glass. I stumbled backward, my mind reeling. The mirror seemed to be some sort of portal, a gateway to another realm where this disturbing entity existed. I fled the attic, my breath coming in ragged gasps, the thumping noise following me down the stairs, growing louder with each step. I grabbed my phone and called the local authorities, trying to explain the situation, but the fear in my voice made it difficult to convey the urgency of the situation. When the police arrived, they found nothing unusual. The attic was empty, the mirror still covered in dust. They checked the entire house, but there were no signs of any intruder or any unusual activity. They reassured me that it was probably just the house settling, and I was left feeling frustrated and scared. Despite their reassurances, the incidents continued. The thumping noise became a nightly occurrence, and the feeling of being watched grew more intense. I started seeing the figure from the mirror in my dreams, a haunting presence that seemed to follow me wherever I went. The nightmares were vivid and terrifying, each one more disturbing than the last. I began to isolate myself, avoiding the attic and spending most of my time on the lower floors of the house. The thumping noise continued, and the feeling of dread never left me. I tried to contact experts in paranormal phenomena, but they were either too far away or too skeptical to take me seriously. One night, in a moment of desperation, I decided to confront whatever was in the attic. I armed myself with a flashlight and a baseball bat, determined to put an end to the terror. I made my way up the narrow stairs, the thumping growing louder with each step. As I reached the attic, I found the mirror had been moved to the center of the room. The reflection was clearer than ever, and the figure was now standing right behind me. I felt a cold hand on my shoulder and spun around, but there was no one there. The thumping turned into a deafening roar, and the room seemed to spin around me. I was overwhelmed by a sense of dread and hopelessness, as if I was trapped in a nightmare that I could never escape. The mirror's reflection grew darker and more distorted, and the figure's expression twisted into a grotesque, malicious grin. I stumbled backward, my heart racing, and the flashlight flickered and died. The attic was plunged into darkness, and I could hear the figure moving closer, its breath cold and rancid against my skin. I felt a pressure on my chest, as if something was trying to suffocate me. In a last-ditch effort, I swung the baseball bat at the mirror, shattering it into 1,000 pieces. The noise stopped abruptly, and the oppressive presence seemed to lift. I collapsed to the floor, gasping for breath, my body trembling with fear. The police were called again, and this time they took me seriously. They conducted a thorough investigation but found no evidence of any unusual activity. They suggested that I might be experiencing stress or hallucinations, but I knew what I had seen and felt. I decided to leave the house, unable to bear the constant fear and unease. I packed up my belongings and put the house up for sale, eager to escape the nightmares that had plagued me. The house remained on the market for months, and I hoped that whoever bought it would be able to deal with the lingering presence that I could not. The nightmares never fully went away, and the feeling of being watched stayed with me. I moved to a new place, trying to start fresh, but the memories of the house and the man in the attic haunted me. I could never forget the distorted reflection, the oppressive darkness, and the sense of dread that had become an inescapable part of my life. As time passed, I tried to put the past behind me, but the nightmares and the fear never fully left. The man in the attic remained a haunting presence, a reminder of the darkness that had once consumed my life. It was supposed to be a simple roommate arrangement. I had just moved to a new city for work and was searching for a place to stay. That's when I found an ad for a room in a charming old Victorian house. The rent was affordable, and the house seemed picturesque with its antique furnishings and ivy-clad walls. The only catch was that the landlord was a bit reclusive, but that didn't bother me much. When I met my roommate, Ethan, he seemed like a regular guy in his early 30s, friendly enough with an easygoing attitude. We exchanged pleasantries, and I was shown to my room, which was cozy and well-furnished. Everything seemed perfect. However, as the weeks went by, something felt off. I initially chalked it up to adjusting to a new city and a new living situation. Ethan would often disappear for days on end, leaving me alone in the house. He never provided much of an explanation for his absences, simply saying he had things to take care of. I didn't think much of it until one evening when I came home to find the house in disarray. Drawers were open, furniture was askew, and Ethan's usually meticulous room was a mess. At first, I thought maybe Ethan had had a particularly hectic day, but as the days went on, the situation didn't improve. One night, I heard strange noises coming from Ethan's room. Muffled whispers, shuffling sounds, and the occasional thud. I knocked on his door, but there was no response. Hesitantly, I turned the handle, and the door creaked open. The room was completely unlike how I had last seen it. The walls were covered in strange markings, crudely drawn symbols, and hastily scrawled words. The bed was unmade, and the sheets were stained with dark, unfamiliar substances. I searched through the room, but Ethan was nowhere to be found. I did, however, find something disturbing. A journal filled with bizarre and unsettling entries. Ethan had written about hearing voices, seeing shadows move, and feeling an oppressive presence in the house. The final entry was a frantic scrawl. "It's coming for me. I don't know how much longer I can stay here. I can hear it scratching at the walls." Alarmed, I decided to confront Ethan when he returned. But days turned into weeks, and he never came back. I reached out to the landlord, but he was evasive and dismissive, claiming that Ethan had moved out and that I should simply find another roommate. The house began to feel increasingly oppressive. The strange noises continued, and I started to feel as though I was being watched. Shadows seemed to move in the corners of my vision, and I could hear faint scratching sounds from the walls. My anxiety grew, but I was determined to get to the bottom of the situation. One night, I woke up to find the scratching sounds louder than ever. They seemed to be coming from inside the walls, almost as if something was trying to break through. The noises grew more frantic, accompanied by low, guttural growls that sent chills down my spine. I decided to investigate further. I searched the house for any clues, focusing on the areas where the noises seemed to originate. Eventually, I found a small hidden door in the basement, covered by an old, dust-covered rug. With trembling hands, I opened the door, revealing a narrow staircase leading down into darkness. The basement was a labyrinth of narrow, twisting corridors, dimly lit by a few flickering bulbs. The air was cold and damp, carrying a nauseating stench of decay. As I ventured deeper, I noticed more of the strange symbols and markings on the walls, similar to those in Ethan's room. I came to a large empty room with a single dim light hanging from the ceiling. In the center of the room was a wooden table covered in strange, ritualistic items, candles, jars of odd substances, and what looked like blood-stained rags. Symbols covered the walls, their meanings now more apparent and disturbing, evoking ancient dark rituals. In the corner of the room, I found something that made my blood run cold. A small, locked cage. Inside the cage was a dirty, ragged blanket, and on the floor lay a few scraps of food and water. The sight filled me with a deep, visceral fear as I realized that it was meant for a person. The scratching noises grew louder, now accompanied by desperate whispers. I turned to see a shadowy figure in the corner of the room, its form indistinct but unmistakably human. I approached cautiously, calling out, but the figure remained silent. It was then that I noticed the figure's face. It was Ethan. Or rather, it looked like Ethan, but with a gaunt, hollow expression. Ethan, or the thing that looked like him, stared at me with wide, terrified eyes. He opened his mouth to speak, but only incoherent mumblings escaped. His body shook with fear, and he seemed unable to move. I felt a wave of dread and confusion. How could he be here, and why was he so frightened? As I tried to understand what was happening, the shadows around the room seemed to close in, the air growing colder and heavier. The whispers grew louder, merging into a cacophony of voices that seemed to speak in unison. The temperature dropped further, and a feeling of malevolence filled the room. I turned to leave, but the shadows seemed to reach out, coiling around my limbs and pulling me back. The cage rattled, and the whispers became urgent, almost pleading. The room seemed to shift and distort, the walls closing in and the shadows twisting into grotesque shapes. In a panic, I fled the basement, racing up the stairs and slamming the door behind me. I felt the oppressive presence of the shadows pressing against me, as if they were trying to pull me back into the darkness. I ran out of the house, not stopping until I reached the safety of the streetlights outside. The next morning, I contacted the authorities and reported the situation, but when they investigated, they found nothing. The basement was empty, the cage gone, and the ritualistic items had disappeared. The officers found the house to be in a perfectly normal condition and dismissed my claims as the result of stress and imagination. I moved out of the house immediately and found a new place to stay, but the experience left me deeply scarred. I still hear the scratching noises sometimes, even in my new apartment, and the whispers haunt my dreams. I can't escape the feeling that something dark and malevolent is still following me, lurking just out of sight. The house was eventually rented out to new tenants, and the landlord refused to acknowledge anything unusual. I often wonder if they've experienced the same horrors I did. I can't shake the feeling that the shadows in the basement are waiting, that the cage is still there, and that the malevolent presence is still active. To this day, I avoid that part of town, too afraid to see the house or learn what might have become of it. The memory of Ethan's terrified eyes and the oppressive darkness in the basement remains with me, a constant reminder of the dark, unseen forces that lurk just beyond the veil of our reality.